to AUC. I'm Maysa Ayoub from the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies, and I'm happy today to welcome the Mixed Migration Hub, the public platform of the North Africa Mixed Migration Task Force. We are starting this initiative of organizing a talk with the Mixed Migration Hub. Today we are happy to welcome Dr. Elisa Pasquashi from Sussex University. Yes. Okay. Okay, I will properly introduce her. She will present the finding of a recent study on condition and risk of mixed migration in Northeast Africa using a human rights lens. She will highlight migration trend systems in the MENA region with the aim to fuel the discussion on the topic. She is a postdoctoral, currently she is a postdoctoral researcher at the Academy of Finland Center of Excellence for Research in Boarding and Transnational Process, University of Tampere, Finland. Her work focuses on refugee migration and refugee governors in North Africa and the Mediterranean region. And her PhD is Human Geography from the University of Sussex in 2014. I would like first to give the floor to Audrey from the Mixed Migration Hub to just introduce what they're doing, and then we will give the floor to Elisa to present the finding of her study. Elisa will talk for like 40 minutes, and then we will open the floor for discussion and questions. Please, Audrey.
Can you hear me okay? Should I know? Not so much, but... Oh, yeah, maybe. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the research launch of the study for conditioned mixed migration in Northeast Africa. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the CMRS staff for your collaboration and coordination in hosting this presentation. I'm Audrey Metcalf, as mentioned, with the Mixed Migration Hub, or MHub as it's also known. For those less familiar, MHub works on behalf of the North Africa Mixed Migration Task Force, consisting of the Danish-Refugee-Council, the International Organization for Migration, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Regional Mixed Migration Secretariat, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. It promotes a human rights-based approach to ensuring the protection of people moving in mixed and complex flows to, through, and from North Africa. MHub produces knowledge via original research, data collection, and our monthly mixed migration trend bulletins on human rights protection issues faced by people on the move in North Africa. And ideally, this is used by policymakers, agencies, donors, public, and academia, with a view to inform advocacy, policy, and program development, all of which with hard copies on the side for you to take home with you. One such output is this study with the University of Sussex, executed by their researchers. So the research topic was pursued upon guidance from the task force, and assessment with MHub identified knowledge gaps, and the expert researchers provide further insight. The researchers involved include Michael Collier, Lisa Pasquashi, might want to help me with the pronunciation of the remainder, Bashar Ahmed, Marcus Brenis, and Vanessa. That one, thank you. The report focused on the conditions of risk of mixed migration in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and the experiences of people who are on the move. The lack of safe, regular migration opportunity drives migration underground, leading to risks of human rights violations and abuses on the journey. These circumstances of humanitarian protection appear to be growing across the region, but the detailed information is still lacking, which is why there's this kind of research. So this evening, we're pleased to have with us Elisa Pasquashi, who has already been so kindly introduced with her background. And yeah, so without further ado, I pass it over to Elisa to tell us all about the research. Thank you.
Hi, good evening everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Audrey and Maysa for organizing this report launch. So as Audrey said, I'm going to present the findings of the research project and report entitled Conditions and Risks of Mixed Migration in Northeast Africa. I am one of the members of the team of 5 researchers who worked on this. I'm going to talk for probably even research team, as we might want to know a little bit more about us and how we came to do this. Then give you a sense of the rationale of the research question, like why to look into this, into conditions and risk of mixed migration in Northeast Africa. Of the methodology of the project as well, not too in detail, but we can talk further about that in the question if you're interested in it. And then I will go through a series of thematic sections. I will talk about the roots, protection and human rights, the role of states and the role of sources of information in determining migrant journeys. At the end, I will take some time to, I think, read parts of the conclusions of the report and comment on them and explain them, because I think the conclusions are particularly effective. You will excuse me if I read. The report is not out yet. It's been printed, so no one has read it. I think most of you didn't, so it might be useful to go through the conclusions, because I think there are quite some strong elements, some strong analytical elements that is worth highlighting. So, to start, this is the research team. I'm one of the researchers who work on this. I'm not the principal investigator, I'm not the person who led this project. Who is Dr. Michael Collier, who's a reader in human geography at the University of Sussex in the UK. The university has a quite famous and well-established Centre for Migration Research, which is mostly based at the Geography Department, but also includes the anthropology, scholars from anthropology, international relations, politics, and so forth. Vanessa Yaria was based at the Council for British Research in the Lebanon in Jordan. Most of her work is on the Middle East and North Africa. At the moment, she moved on to another position in an international organization. And then the other three researchers are Bashar Ahmed, who's a Sudanese British researcher. And she took care of the part of the research and the field work in Sudan. Marcus Breines is an anthropologist by training. He's an Ethiopianist. He speaks Amharic, and he, for this report, he did undertake research in Ethiopia. And I myself, as Maisa said, I'm not currently based at the University of Sussex. I moved to the Academy of Finland Relate Center in Finland, but I still have an affiliation to the University of Sussex, where I did my PhD. My PhD was on Egypt, on migration in Egypt. And therefore, this is not my first time here. I worked here in 2011, 2012, and it's actually a pleasure to be back at the UC on this occasion. So, the research questions. Why to look at conditions and risks of migration in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and also to a lesser extent in the Mediterranean. Like, why to look at the Northeast African route and how this route extends through Mediterranean crossings, and what are the effects also in the northern region. Some of you might be familiar with the article by Roger Zetter and Gadi Benazer that recently came out in the Journal of Refugee Studies, in which they, both scholars, highlight how we actually have significant lacks in the current knowledge about migrant journey. So we think we do know a lot, but we are constantly working with categories and assumptions that in some cases do not match what is an increasingly complex and shifting and unstable reality. So there is, I think, in general, academically speaking, a need for new research and new research approaches to migrant journey and migrant routes. But why in particular Northeast Africa? I think recently, well after we set out to work on this research, recently in the last year, in the last months in particular, we have seen that most of the attention of donor and international media shifted towards the Eastern Mediterranean route. I work and live in Scandinavia, and most of the media coverage of the migration crisis in the Mediterranean region is about the Syrian displacement through Turkey, Greece, the Aegean, and then Balkans and Eastern Europe. And it's like what happens in the central Mediterranean and in North Africa is kind of, getting away from public attention. And there are even attempts to, reframe the way in which we consider we look at the protection needs of migrants who transit to North Africa and the Northeast African route in particular. I'm thinking, for example, about the recent initiative by the Danish government that through a very controversial report that caused much international outcry, tried to contest, somehow call into question the need for international protection and humanitarian protection of Eritrean migrants and asylum seekers. So that's an example of how the donor attitude and donor agenda towards migration in North Africa and Northeast Africa is changing, and why there is need somehow to look into those issues with more attention and to keep the attention on this area of the world. So in order to do that, in this report, we are looking in particular at two things. I think one is the flows of information and finance. So in what are the network, what are the material ways that sustain the journey of people on the Northeast African migration route, and in particular in Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt. And the second is the emerging protection needs, the shifting scenario, if you want, of protection needs in what is a mixed migration context. That is to say, in a context where different categories of migrants with different background and different protection needs travel together, and where motivation are blurred and very difficult to distinguish in many cases. I think as academics, we have the luxury not to have to consider what is the actual policy applicability of the analysis we make, even though we have to, but we can take the liberty to look at protection needs in a more holistic way, if you want. So kind of start suggesting new way of looking at those things that go beyond the legal and the policy categories that we already have. So that's what we try to do humbly, and obviously always keeping into consideration what is the policy reality, the policy context that we are operating with. But I think it's important also to try and go, cautiously and perhaps slowly, but try to go beyond a bit the categories that we already operate with. So the methodology, I'm not going to be too tedious with this. Obviously, we did a literature review, a quite long and systematic one, which encompassed legal and policy frameworks and an existing analysis of migration trends, and in particular the regional approach to migration management. And I think in the conclusion we go back of the report, we go back to the regional approach, why we think it is important, and we look into those issues, considering the needs and the context, the political and social context of the region, and not just the needs and the desires of the European powers that very often set the agenda in this context. So what we did is around 100 qualitative in-depth interviews in 5 countries and 13 cities. As I said before, the report focuses on Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt mostly, but we did interviews with migrants who transit or through or come from this country, also in Malta and Libya. That was something we decided to do because we thought that talking to people in a different context might give us the chance to gather different data and have possibly different responses to similar questions to those that we asked in Egypt, in Sudan, or in Ethiopia. And actually, it was quite useful to have that kind of comparison with people who have already reached Europe. And then we also talked to about 25 between IO, NGO, and government officials, even though we had problems in talking to government officials, and we could only access them in the Ethiopian case. In the other countries it was not possible. And in general, practitioners and even journalists in some cases. Here I have a list of the limitations of what we did. So obviously the sample is qualitatively very diversified and rich, I think, but it's not quantitatively representative. By quantitatively, I mean 100 interviews is not a small number for a qualitative study. I mean statistically representative. Obviously it's not, because it's not a randomized sample. And we had access issues that we can talk more about if you want. I think it's important to discuss those kind of things and what are the difficulties that researchers face today in looking at those things, particularly Sudan and Egypt. As I said, lack of access to state officials. We have a gender bias in the sense that we didn't talk to too many women, especially in Italy. And then there is a lack of participant observation, like it wasn't possible, there wasn't the time, and there weren't, especially the security conditions in many contexts, to actually go out and about and talk to people where they live, where they start their journey from. And that is an important limitation, but we couldn't do it for a number of reasons that I'm open to discuss in the question section if you want. So this is just a quick table to show you how many people we talked to. So the number of migrants we met is actually higher than the number of interviews with migrants that we list at the end of the report. This is because we talked to families and we consider the interviews as only one, even though we talked to all the members of the family. So as you see, the vast majority of the people we spoke to were from Ethiopia. Yeah. The second biggest group is the Sudanese. There is an underrepresentation of Syrians. It's true that Syrians do not use this route much, but there are, I think Syrians are the biggest refugee group in Egypt, so it is a serious limitation that we didn't get to interview many of them. Nonetheless, I think what was needed in order to cover, to have a sense of the route in the region is very much there. Because Syrians in most cases take a different route, at least to reach the North African Mediterranean. So I'm gonna go through a series of to give you some context about the countries where we work, and a little bit, start to map the routes from one country to another, and what previous research and our data tell us about these routes. So the first country we worked in is Ethiopia, and is a major receiving countries of refugees. Most of them come from Eritrea. Ethiopia is a signatory of the most important international instruments for international humanitarian protection, including the 2001 Palermo Protocol. However, the Palermo Protocol is not translated into domestic law. There is a national committee against human trafficking that was founded in 2012, but none of these instruments is actually applied, is actually operating in the country. And somehow it was important to look at Ethiopia in this context because it might seem surprising, but most of the research about migration from Ethiopia and Eritrea as well, most of academic research at least, focuses on migration from the Horn of Africa to the Arab Gulf, at least the most recent one. And actually one of the reasons to do this study, this project in general, was that there was a suggestion that came from the existing literature that there was a rerouting. I mean, a lot of the migration movements that were previously directed towards the Arab Gulf were rerouted towards the Mediterranean and North Africa. And that is partly a consequence, for example, of the introduction of the Ritakat policies in 2013 in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that had a huge impact, particularly on Ethiopian labor migration, on mixed migration as well. And therefore, it's not surprising that most of the researchers focused on movements from Ethiopia to the Arab Gulf, but there is a need now to move on and beyond that because that is not anymore the only relevant, the only central issue. In recent years, as you said, we are starting to observe, as it says here, increased attention to border crossing into Sudan, and particularly in the Metemma area. Metemma is a place that is mentioned in most of our interviews. However, we still know quite little about the dynamics of that particular border crossing. And there is increasing attention also, recent reports by the International Labour Organization, the UNHCR, and the zone, for example, are starting to highlight protection needs and issues of trafficking in the route from Ethiopia to Sudan. So here you see a bit what we found, what we know about people who move from Eritrea and Ethiopia into Sudan. The map is a very sketchy, simple map, like a BBC map that you usually find in the press when they cover, you know, these kind of issues for the general public. I just want to give you a sense of, you know, what the region we are talking about. So in the last 3 months of 2014, nearly 5,000 Eritreans entered Ethiopia each month. Most of them left military camps in Eritrea. And the monthly arrival rate to Sudan in 2015 is around 1,350 people, of whom 80% leave the refugee camps in Sudan within months. This is something we found both in Ethiopia and Sudan. The people who get to refugee camps only to leave them in the space of really few months. So this is a very typical pattern we observed. The Ethiopia to Sudan border crossing takes place mostly via Humera and Metemma, which are in the northern region, in the northern part of the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. As far as the crossing from Eritrea to Sudan is concerned, instead the most relevant element that emerges from this research is the involvement of Eastern Sudan border tribes in the smuggling networks. And then the route across Sudan, something most of you are probably familiar with, Shagarab to Khartoum. And Khartoum remains a very important, central, significant transit and destination in Sudan, in the country. The route through Metemma and Humera is a very established one. It's been, you know, used for several years. This is an example. One of our interviewees, you're going to see a series of slides, and you will excuse me for the huge amount of text I put on the slides. So these are quotes. I just want to give you a sense of what the people we spoke to actually told us. So PY is a 25-year-old man from Adigrat in Ethiopia. He went to Israel via Sudan in 2010. He organized his trip to Sudan by phone from Adigrat with an agent in Humera and traveled with regular bus transport to the border town. He paid 4,500 birr, so $222 approximately, US dollars, to be taken across the border. He says, we crossed to Sudan by foot. It took about 4 hours of walking and crossing the Tekeza River with rope and floating jerry cans. People pulled the rope to help us cross. We were 19 people traveling together, and everybody arrived okay to Sudan. In Sudan, we went by foot to a place called Hamlait and spent a night there. There was no food when we were walking, and it was very difficult. There was no information, and we were taken to Shegarab camp by car. So this is a person who took that route in 2010 and was interviewed by Marcus, my colleague in Ethiopia, you know, around 5 years after having done that trip and having come back to Ethiopia. Nevertheless, what he says about his border crossing is very much similar to what happens nowadays. So Humera and Metemma are very much central places and are likely to remain in the future as well in this particular region area. Then to move into Sudan, which is the second country where we were, just very, very brief, you know, essential information. Obviously, Sudan is also an important source, transit and destination country. According to UNHCR estimates, there could be up to 460,000 refugees and asylum seekers in the country by the end of 2015, mostly South Sudanese and Eritrean. And it's very important to understand also the policy context of Sudan, to consider that Sudan continues to be a country that is massively interested by, you know, the phenomenon of internally displaced population. So we are talking about the government and society that have to deal with millions of people who move internally because of armed conflict. So that's the context where, initiative towards curbing, for example, international trafficking and smuggling have to be taken. Not to mention, obviously, poverty and the political and economic concerns that we all are aware of. So I'm going to cover routes from Sudan to Libya and from Sudan to Egypt. When we carried out this research between the end of 2014 and beginning of 2015, most of our interviewees reported a considerable reduction of crossing into Egypt. They started to notice a considerable reduction of crossing into Egypt due to the tightening of border security. As a consequence, some of them mentioned having done personally or knowing people who were going to, take into consideration, examine the possibility of traveling to Libya instead, because the lack of a government, the instability in the country was perceived as an opportunity to actually probably travel more freely. The route from Khartoum to Libya crosses the northern state of Sudan and then proceeds onwards through the desert to Ufra, as you see over there. And this is the border crossing where the highest level of abuse is reported by migrants we interviewed. The people who went through the most violent experiences were the people who went through that border crossing, and particularly in the southern region of Libya, immediately after crossing the border with Sudan. So that was, it is a very dangerous area, and it is interesting that some people consider that more viable somehow than for example, crossing into Egypt, in spite of the risks. And we can talk more about that, about the relationship between, awareness of risk, availability of information, and the decision people actually make. Because I think there is an interesting and not so straightforward relation between those things. So that's a very important element that any policy, I think, in this context has to take into account. So I'm going to give you some details about Khartoum and Sudan. I don't know much about Sudan myself, so those are part of the report that my colleague Bashar, who's partly from Khartoum and knows the city very well, wrote about. She said that according to her interviewees, Souk Libya and Al Haj Youssef are the key transport hubs in Khartoum for those traveling in and outside the capital. The majority of those smuggled are transported in buses to avoid attracting attention. And after passing the last checkpoint in Khartoum state towards the Dongola, people are transferred into pickup trucks, referred to as Thatcher, for the desert journey to the Libyan border. So that was for the route from Sudan to Libya. You have to bear in mind that this is, as I said, probably the most dangerous area, the most dangerous border crossing we came across in this context. Egypt, on the other hand, this is the list of border crossing from Sudan to Egypt that we came across while researching this report. There are still several concerns about abuse, forms of violence, coercion, and trafficking that more or less correspond to the legal definition, the policy definition of trafficking. But it's overall, it is much safer compared to crossing into Libya. It is, obviously. But it is more difficult because of the tightening of border control recently. So, the route. So there is the classic Aswan Lake Nasser route, which is the route taken by most people who come to Cairo to register with the UNHCR. Most of the migrants we interviewed, 17 out of 21, transited through this route. There are reports of people being held for ransom, even in the south of Egypt. And that's a question that we have to bear in mind in relation to the question of the trafficking that used to take place in Sinai, having been rerouted to other areas of particularly Sudan, but maybe also other countries in the region. However, this is a very popular route, and it is definitely the most used one. Then there is the East to Waynard route. I named it like rerouted hopes because it's basically a route that crosses the New Valley Governorate. I don't know how many of you have been there or are familiar with. I have been. I took some geography students from the UK to visit the Toshka project. So it is an area which is famous for big water engineering projects started under Mubarak. At the moment, the people who transit there are mostly small logistic convoys that have been rerouted on their way to Libya towards Egypt. So it's not people who ended up there by choice in most cases. We didn't interview anyone who crossed through that border crossing, but we do know that it exists because we talked to other stakeholders in Egypt. The Alaki Valley and Halaya Triangle, you might be familiar with the issue of illegal gold mining in Sudan and people who cross the border to gold mine. So those are mostly the people who used to use that border crossing. But recently we have seen other categories of migrants going from other regions of Sudan, and particularly from Khartoum, towards that region to cross into Egypt. So in 2014, I mean, all of the interviews we had in Cairo, in Egypt, were done in the second half of 2014. So we had a number of people who had transited to that route as well. And then we have two routes that are used in and out of Egypt, particularly the Cairo-Matrub and Razi route. It used to be a route used mostly to leave the country and go to Libya, basically, and then try border crossing into the Mediterranean. It is now we're starting to see a movement in the opposite direction as well. Alexandra and Damietta have been, particularly in 2013, 2014, there have been irregular crossing of the Mediterraneans living from those cities, and it's been a very serious issue in Egypt. At the moment, that movement stopped, but it was still quite relevant, and several stakeholders talked about that when we did the research in Egypt. So I said I was not going to talk for too long, but I'm just halfway through the slides, and I probably have 10 minutes left. That's good news, because it means we have more to say than I expected. I'm not going to go through the quotes I have here. This is an example of a Syrian family that crossed the border actually through Lake Nasser to come to Egypt after a very complicated journey that left them very, very traumatized. And they were still very traumatized when they talked to me. Well, they went first to Algeria, then to Sudan, and then eventually to Egypt. They were still very scared about the legal situation, even though they had UNHCR papers. All these quotes are in the report, so do read them. But we took a lot of time, carefully transcribing. We wanted these kind of testimonies to be there, available for everyone, also to gain your own idea about beyond our analysis. I'm not going to give you data about Egypt. You all know, most of you work here in this field. 4 main areas of human rights protection concern that we highlighted in the whole region in general, not just in Egypt. So in the research in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. So the onward movement of recognized refugees, as I said, people who live in refugee camps in Sudan, in Ethiopia, there is really a need to look into the issue of refugee camps and why they keep producing so massively waves of migration towards the north. High levels of individual abuse that call into question in many ways the relation between smuggling and trafficking. They complicate it if you want. The issue of rerouted trafficking and smuggling from Sinai to the Sudanese borders with Eritrea and Khartoum and southern Egypt. There is an article that came out recently in the Middle Eastern Report by Dan Connolly. I don't know if you read it, about the rerouted trafficking in Eritrean migrants. It's a very interesting suggestion that what used to take place in Sinai is now basically, just rerouted and displaced in other areas of the region. Very well documented, this one. And, we seem to have gathered to this report data that confirm that insight. The widespread lack of documentation, I think one of the things we highlight in the conclusion of this report is that there is a need to reconsider the way we look at undocumentedness. It's a much more complex phenomenon than just a strategic choice to get rid of one's document not to be identified or identifiable. And then the issue of unaccompanied minors. When I did research in Egypt for this report, a lot of case workers and NGO workers here told me that they had, and community workers as well, the Oromo community in particular, they told me that they started to see an increase in the number of unaccompanied minors coming to Egypt. We have some interested testimonies. This is about leaving Ethiopia and the reason to leaving Ethiopia, traveling to Egypt. This is the issue about undocumentedness and surviving in Egypt with the UNHCR white paper, and this very complex, also bureaucratic and technical issue, but which nonetheless are very relevant for people's lives and also for their decision to stay in a place or not. This is another of the stories, like wrong quotes you're going to find in the report. It's about one of the unaccompanied minors we interviewed in Egypt. It was a Oromo boy of 16. I said I was going to talk about sources of information. That's probably very interesting. One of the most interesting things for policymakers and people, who have to deal with this phenomenon from the perspective of taking operational decisions and, devising policies. I think there is this report by the IIS that came out in 2015 that says, there is a need to completely rethink the way we conceive information campaigning for migrants, because there's no point in telling people it's dangerous, it's risky. They all know very well that it is. And actually, what we can say is that this is definitely true. This is definitely a correct insight. This is not a helpful way of looking into the issue. People are aware of risk, but the quality, we should also take into account that the quality and the sources of information vary greatly. So you have a general awareness of the risk and even of the deadliness of the risk, but people do not have the detailed information that would allow them to take smart decisions that would avoid or minimize the harm and the risk they undergo in specific situation. Partly because the situations are unstable and shifting, for example, the security condition in specific countries, but partly also because information do not travel so, consistently, and not everyone has access to the same sources. Another interesting thing that we found is that, especially for the youngest people among those we talked to, the first contact with smugglers is very often taken via members of the family, older members of the family. The interviews, particularly in Malta and Italy, confirmed the increasing role. There is a lot of research done, academic research as well done in that area recently. The role of social media and mobile phones in allowing people to stay connected and actually determining their decision making while en route. We have contrasting evidence, I think, about the role of negative experiences as a deterrent towards trying to illegally cross borders and get into very dangerous situations. We have, I think, different data that can be interpreted in different ways, so that's an issue to be evaluated very, very carefully. I'm not going to go through these, those are other quotes. Role of the states. Obviously, this is something that is quite straightforward, that our data confirm. There is a clear relation between the effectiveness of government authority and the incidence of trafficking and smuggling. So where there is a government that works, obviously this kind of problems can be tackled more effectively, and this is largely what we see clearly in this report as well. The issue of collusion between facilitators and state officials, it's an issue that has been brought up, particularly in Sudan and Libya. Obviously, it's very hard to gather any kind of reliable evidence on that, so we don't know much. We only know that people say, smugglers pay bribes to Sudanese police, these kind of things. But there is very, very little research, also previous research, to refer to in this context. Another phenomenon, which is different than collusion, but turning a blind eye on trafficking, on smuggling, on illegal migration. But this is something that happens also in a lot of European countries. especially Southern European. I mean, that some things are just let happen strategically in some cases, and I think that happens in most of the world. It's part of managing migration in a way. So the conclusions I was going to read, I'm not going to read. I'm going to just restate some things that I think are important and that you're going to find in the report. The first, most general, concluding remark to be made is that migration along the route is a highly complex phenomenon. It's much more complex and much more constantly shifting than we actually know. There is a friend of mine who works, an anthropologist who works in Morocco, and she always says that she tells her students of anthropology, like, whoever tells you that knows what is going on is telling you a lie. Those things are changing so rapidly and are so difficult to understand and to keep track of, that we always have to be somehow humble in our conclusion, strong in our analysis as much as possible, but also be aware that there are many things that we cannot possibly know because of the limits also of our research work. And then one very significant thing that we can say, though, is that in the context of this complex phenomenon, we are pretty sure that what happens in North Africa cannot be reduced to a one-way travel towards Europe. There is a very Eurocentric, tendency in the way in which we consider migration. So basically, most of what is written, reported, done about migration in North Africa is motivated by the need to understand and control migration towards Europe. But actually, a lot of what happens in this area of the world responds to regional dynamic and needs responses that are calibrated according to this political context and this societal context, rather than according to the needs of the European countries and the European agenda. Obviously, social networks and availability of information and chronic insecurities are the main element that makes this picture so unstable and so ever-shifting. Then, as I said, in the conclusions, we also highlight the emerging protection concerns, so the things I said before, the shifting boundaries between trafficking and smuggling, and the issue of unaccompanied minors, and the issue of lack of documentation, which is a very important thing that I would be happy to talk more about. And then, yes, we also decided to strongly restate at the end that regional responses that take into account the complexity of the phenomenon and work in the instrument of migrants and hosting society are needed, rather than simply responding to European pressure. So there is a need to look at these, in a way that is more attentive to what happened in the region, and the way migration is linked to other social and political phenomena around as well. I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's very interesting, and I think it's
So those are our contacts. Be here, but it would be very happy to respond, to questions that you might have.
Is now available digitally on the MHub website. If you're on the mailing list already, we'll be sending out that link. If not, on the website, you can sign up for it to receive the monthly bulletins, as well as anything else that we have going on, any information that comes through MHub. So please do that. Also, if you haven't already, there's plenty of materials about MHub and research and ongoing things. So please help
awareness campaigns and what should the responses in this area focus on if simple awareness campaigns about risk and danger are not effective, they're not enough? What could possibly be done? I think there are two ways to answer that question. One would be, the ideal, if you want, the utopian way would be, yes, you have to increase resettlement, you have to make more available, you have to increase the number of available legal routes for people to reach a safe destination. And a lot of the people we talked to kind of highlighted this incredible paradox. It's one of the hugest, paradoxes of the international order, and we all became absolutely used to that. But say, if I make it to, Sweden one day, they would treat me as a refugee straight away. But in order to make it there, I have to leave my home country, go through a series of refugee camps, and go through a number of situations that are absolutely dreadful, where, instead of getting protection, I increase my protection needs because I become further violated and traumatized. And but eventually, when I get to a destination, I am a refugee. So wasn't I a refugee when I started my journey as well? So why do I have to go through that? It doesn't make any sense. And ideally, obviously, the way to tackle that would be increasing protection spaces, increasing resettlement. Obviously, that is not likely to be possible in the current political climate. We have to be realistic and look at who sets the agenda for these, who are the donors, where does the money that animates, that keeps the policies going comes from, and what is likely to happen. One of the things we wondered while discussing this report was whether there could be a qualitatively different way of devising awareness campaigns, where rather than trying to persuade people not to migrate, we could just give them more detailed information when possible. In a way that is very calibrated, very adapted to the context where they are, about what they are actually going to face, years by years, month by month, what is happening. That could kind of, reduce the harm as like the kind of harm reduction approach that is used in public policies in other contexts with vulnerable categories. So that's my answer to your questions. But obviously, yes, ideally what should be done is there should be more ways for people to get legally to a safe place. Yeah. The second question about the Eurocentric approach and whether people mention a different final destination. Yes, most of them did. And actually, a lot of the Ethiopians we talked to, both in Ethiopia and in Egypt, came to Egypt after having had to leave, kind of forcefully, Yemen or Saudi Arabia, for example. So there was already at the beginning of the migratory project a destination that wasn't Europe, at all. It was an Arab country in the Arab Gulf, and the reason why they had to leave was that their legal situation didn't allow them to stay there anymore safely, and the people were, massively deported, and they left, and then they tried to cross to Sudan with an initial idea to get to Khartoum and possibly find a livelihood there. This is something you keep finding. Also, a lot of the people who left internally displaced camps in Sudan, for example, they would tell you that their first idea was to get to major cities in Libya and work there. And I think there is, at the beginning, an idea that, yes, the destination at the beginning of the process is Libya. And the idea is, I'll just go there and work and see how things work out, basically. I could stay for longer if things go well, or then I could just simply decide that I can't live there possibly because it's not safe, or because my family has economic needs that cannot be met through simply staying in Libya and try my luck if I can somewhere else. But yeah, there is absolutely a need to acknowledge and to take into account that, whereas we are absolutely all obsessed with stopping, in Europe, as a European I'm speaking, unfortunately, with stopping migration to Europe, which is a very small, numerically small phenomenon compared to, I mean, how many Syrians are living in Lebanon currently. I think Lebanon is the country with the highest population refugee ratio. And Germany is one of the richest countries of the world, and they have, I think, less than half of the number of refugees Lebanon has. Yeah, much less than half. And this is to give you an example of the kind of absolute lack of proportion about the panic and the policy and media attention towards migration into Europe and what actually happens in North Africa and in other regions of the world. Yeah, so the destination is not necessarily Europe, and that should be taken into account. Definitely, yeah. Your question about the conditions in Sudan, I mentioned very quickly about the situation in Sudan, and particularly about Sudan being a country where there is a still very significantly high number of internally displaced people. I cannot tell you much more than that. I'm not a Sudan specialist, so I cannot provide you any analysis about the political and economic situation in Sudan. But definitely, Sudan needs to be considered much more as also as a source of migration because of the situation you mentioned, because of the ongoing conflict in Darfur, for example, and also because of the condition, again, of the IDP camps. A lot of the people we talked to, both in Malta, Italy, and Egypt, were coming from those camps. There is really, the typical report is about extreme poverty and lack of the minimum, subsistence means. So there is a very serious concern about protection in that context. And yes, the route by ship from Sudan to Egypt that you mentioned, the one that goes through Lake Nasser, as I said, most of the people we interviewed in Egypt come to Egypt from Sudan via Aswan or via Lake Nasser. And it is very common. Other people live from Port Sudan. Yeah, it is one of the most significant routes. Yeah. There is a lot of very interesting research on Sudan. If you want suggestions, we can further discuss about it. But I think that's the conditions of many countries that are refugee-producing countries today. Syria was also one of the countries with the most, evolved, I think, and sophisticated public infrastructures in the Middle East. And today is completely destroyed. And it is the biggest, probably, refugee-producing countries in North Africa and the Middle East. So, yeah, it's a common pattern, unfortunately.
Most of the refugees are from the south, not from the south.
Yeah, I would say most of them are from Darfur and the south. Well, if you mean the south of Sudan, not South Sudan. Yeah, but there are also people who had, I think at least lived for a significantly long period of time in Khartoum among the people we talked to. Yeah, so, yeah. Your questions about the causes of situations that produce refugees, I have to give the same answer I gave just earlier. There is no easy answer to that. There is not an answer that will cover, the whole region and all the countries, all the refugee-producing countries in the region. One of the things I think that is most interesting for, policymakers and people who work in the field is probably considering what happens in refugee camps, particularly in Ethiopia and Sudan, those that host Eritreans. That is an interesting refugee-producing, like the onwards movement of recognized refugees from those countries. That is an interesting movement, an interesting immediate cause of further, asylum seekers and further movement that can be looked into, because other causes are way too complex to be, I think, addressed in the space of this kind of research and this discussion, probably. The challenge faces researchers, as I said, it was particularly difficult to get to talk to government officials because of a number of reasons. In some cases, people are just, migration is not so high in their agenda as it is for European governments. And then there are, always security concerns and security permissions that have to be obtained before doing research in certain areas or with, certain offices. And obviously, if you don't have them, you can't do many things. Therefore, the data we can produce are limited by that, inevitably. And that's an issue in many countries, not just in North Africa. I think that's a challenge that migration researchers face nowadays. Also, for example, looking at migration detention in the United States. So also in liberal democracies, it is increasingly difficult to do research on irregular migration and migration management in general. Yeah, we can talk more about it if you want. It could be possibly a very, very large discussion. About the methodology, the sampling, as I said, this is not a quantitatively statistically representative sample in any way. This is quintessentially qualitative research that we would have loved and very much wanted to be complemented by ethnographic participant observation. I mentioned some of my colleagues being anthropologists by training. They would have loved, and I think that we would have had a much more complete picture. But just for the reasons I just mentioned, that was not an option in many of the contexts where we were operating. So this sample is not statistically representative, and we are very clear about that in the conclusions. The way we selected the participants is just, I think the first consideration was what is practically accessible in a situation where access is incredibly difficult, and what is safe for us and for our research partners to access, and safe for the people, where and how it is safe for the people to talk to us especially. So we snowballed, to use a term that we use in anthropology and qualitative research. So we use the contacts that we have through the organization we work through their caseworkers, and in some countries through other migrants, like following a little bit the networks. In the limited space we could access. And then the issue about migration from Egypt. We assumed somehow that most of the migration from Egypt is directed towards areas that are other than what is defined as the Northeast African migration route. So we didn't look into that. We could have looked, and it would have been very relevant perhaps to look at movements of Egyptian workers to Libya, to and from Libya, but we couldn't do again because it's not possible to access Libya, and it's not even possible to get anywhere closer to the border in most neighboring countries. So that's one thing we couldn't do. That should be done nonetheless, whenever it is possible. And basically that. So we didn't look. It is true. It is absolutely. I think we tend to forget, especially when we talk about protection and mixed migration, we tend to look at Egypt as a risk country, a receiving or transit countries of refugees and asylum seekers, and we tend to forget that this is one of the most significant, I think, producing countries. Like it is an immigration country, and very much so. It is absolutely important to consider that we couldn't do it. Even within, the North African context, we couldn't look at the movement of Egyptians to Libya, for example. But that's a very relevant thing. Were they four? Okay, yes, you're right. So the first one was on social media and technology, right? Well, our data, the data we collected, especially in Malta and Italy, to confirm that this is a relevant topic. It is an important thing to take into account. And there is a lot of research which is being done. Obviously, yes, it is important. It is significant, and it is becoming very significant as well also for governments. There is a lot of investment nowadays on basing migration control and migration management on research done through big data, for example. That's a different debate, but there is a lot of emphasis on technology. We have very limited data about that, so on the basis of this report, I cannot give you a general assessment, but what I can tell you is that on the basis of the academic literature that is being published currently, I think there is an emerging trend towards, kind of suggesting caution in the way we look at the role of technology in migration, in facilitating migration, in facilitating migrant coping strategies, in facilitating also, for example, humanitarian work. there is a huge debate on the role of technology in humanitarian work, particularly with refugees. And nowadays, a lot of specialists in the field are starting to suggest that we look at this issue a little bit more critically, like that we are actually a little bit more realistic about what technology can or can't do, and what are the things that also technology can make us blind to. So for example, if we rely too much on what we learn about migrants and about their journeys, if we rely too much on technologies to learn about those things, we risk to have an oversimplified picture. So in spite of the difficulties, there is a need, to move beyond what technology tells us, to look into things as they actually take place, through actual relation in social context. Yeah, so that's what I can tell you, generally speaking. Then the legal route, I think the second question was about the ethical, was the gentleman over there, right? It was about the ethical implications of this, and in general of all research that kind of shed light on illegal routes, and whether that make migrants visible to, to border control governments. And yes, that is a concern that is, I think, common to all of the people who do research in this context. What I can tell you is that we don't have I don't think we have done in this particular project, and in most actually academic research, I don't think we went very much ahead of what government already know, of what is already visible. I think, for example, a lot of the abuse, for example, a lot of the way in which Eritrean asylum seekers move. There is so much, there are so many media reports, policy reports that are nowadays available. So those issues are so widely documented that, it is not necessarily factually new what we documented. Our aim was to look at that qualitatively and analytically in a way to understand it in a different way. But I don't think most of the research we are doing actually say much new to governments. So there is obviously an ethical concern, and it should always be there. And I'm sure that, unfortunately, we sometimes end up doing harm unwillingly as researchers as well. That's always a risk when you're dealing with people, unfortunately. But I don't think we can actually do that much. Yeah, unfortunately as well. So there's a dual aspect to it. On the one end, it's good that we can't do that kind of harm, but it also tells you something about, how limited what we know is. The communities, the host communities and local governments, no, we couldn't talk to local governments. The only country where we did interviews with state officials was Ethiopia. We didn't look at the response of host communities because we couldn't do any ethnographic research. There are just significant limitations in terms of research permissions and security concerns. Not just about our individual security, but also, about the space, operational space of the organizations we work with, particularly in Sudan, that prevented us from looking at the impact of migration in the hosting communities. We talked a little bit to community representatives here in Cairo, but that's more about migrant communities and refugees communities that are here in the city. For example, the Oromo community. It was very interesting to talk about what is going on in that group with Oromo and Ethiopian case workers in Cairo. And that somehow links to the other question, which was about coping mechanisms and the role of connection to diasporas and the role of connection with returnees. Again, coping mechanisms, like technology, there is a lot of research on, from the most classical anthropological research on weapons of the weak till the most recent analysis of, coping strategies, resilience of irregular migrants. And we tend to emphasize that a lot, but I think we should be looking more carefully at what these small coping strategies can actually do. I don't think, I mean, what people can do to protect themselves to reduce the risk and the danger they are exposed to is really very little in most cases. And it's very also based on decisions that are extemporaneous and that are not taken, that are not made on the basis of information which is complete and reliable. So coping mechanisms is a very sensitive topic that we should be cautious in handling. But definitely the community plays a role there, and the contact with other migrants and the diaspora groups. And I think the role is also a bit ambivalent, if you want, in the sense that community means also, I mean, the community is often the mediators through which people get into contact with smugglers and you know, these kind of things. So there is support, but there are also very, very significant economic and financial relations that take place within the communities. Yeah.
Yes, so I think the first question was about poverty and the people we talked to. Maybe we talked to the wrong people. I very much thank you for that question because you are absolutely right, and that gives me the chance to say two things. One is, it might be that there is actually a bias in the sample. This is a qualitative sample, and it might be that the people we talk to in every country are particularly vulnerable people, so particularly vulnerable socially and also in terms of protection concerns. But in general, what should be said is that if those people have moved and they manage to leave their country, they are probably not the poorest, you know, in their social background. I think it's a very common experience as for yourself. The people who actually make it out of their country and they manage to connect the money and also the you know, logistic and financial resources to migrate are never the poorest, and that is something that we know that is well ascertained and very widely documented in migration research across the world. So this is definitely something to take into account when we were talking about poverty and you know, lack of substance you know, basic material needs. We were especially referring to IDP camps in Sudan, for example, so these kind of situations. But we also know that also there, I mean, there is social stratification. People are not all the same. And it is not likely that those people are the most vulnerable in their, in their countries of origins. Yeah, so in that sense, you're absolutely right.
Can I follow?
Yeah.
Could we say that the cause rule is not the IDP camps?
Yeah.
Could we say the cause is the wars? The war first.
Yeah.
Why they are in the IDP camps first?
Yeah, sure.
So I think the war first,
Yeah.
not poverty, nothing else.
Yeah. Sorry, I have to answer that question because I don't think we have much time. Then we can take your comments maybe. I think the second question was about conditions in transit countries and also in conditions in countries of origins, and it's true that we didn't look at the root causes of this movement. We focus on the movement. So the purpose of the report was to focus on the movement. There is a lot of other research on the root causes, but it is much. I mean, the purpose of this was to give an instrument, an analytical instrument, however small and limited, to the people who are actually dealing with this phenomena in their policy planning, in their interventions in that regard, assisting migrants on en route. There is a lot of research on the root causes of migration from Africa, but we also have to bear in mind that this is a much more complex question, and yeah, it is much harder to come out with a straightforward answer to that question, to that issue. So yeah, no, we didn't look at that in this report, but it was not the purpose. Then, the migrant and refugee semantics. That's a very interesting debate. Obviously, in the report we do distinguish. I call them migrants simply because this is commonly understood to be an area where mixed migration flows take place. So I thought the term migrants is just more general. It refers more in general to people that move. So it encompasses, if you want. So I use it as a kind of umbrella term that encompasses also asylum seekers and refugees and people with different kind of protection needs. Having said that, obviously there is a need to differentiate, but there's also a need to take into account how the exclusive use of the term refugees today in Europe is having an unexpected, unwanted side effect, if you want. That, you know, it is a very well-meaning act to say, okay, we should be calling those people refugees, but it ended up leading to very much, you know, clear-cut distinctions that, and in a way, you have the sense that it fell into, at least this is my impression and of some of my colleagues, that it's feeding into a perception very much reinforced by the media at the moment that only a certain category of people are refugees, and it is in particular in the European context today the Syrians. So all the rest is not refugees anymore, because we can't very easily identify a conflict where they come from, or because the conflict is not under the spotlight of media anymore. It's very much going on, like for example in Sudan, but we don't know it. I mean, there is still violence, if not a proper declared conflict, but we don't know, we don't hear about that as much.
Although I think in terms of numbers, the Africans are much more.
Yeah, but somehow it has caused recently less problems to the European border management. What happens this summer, for example, through the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, it was really powerful, and Syria is one of the biggest group there, and it forced, I think, European powers to, you know, suspend Schengen, for example, Dublin, and then they suspend Schengen de facto as well, because they had to reintroduce, even though for a limited period of time, border control, for example, between Italy and Austria and several other border crossings. So it is such a powerful, it has at the moment a much stronger effect on Europe, and then there is a much stronger coverage of the Syrian conflict because it is much higher up in the donor and, you know, Western interest as well. So all these kind of things. So yes, definitely we should be differentiating, and we should be clear that those people have protection needs, and there are a lot of refugees. Actually, probably the vast majority of people would qualify even legally as refugees. But we should also be clear about the fact that this is a situation where people who might not meet the legal requirements in some cases, you know, of an asylum seeker or a refugee, are nonetheless exposed to danger and violence. And then, yeah, the fact that the Mediterranean crisis is not, I mean, it's somehow a safe gamble compared to other situations those people are exposed to. When we talk about risk and danger in this context, we refer in particular to the possibility of being exposed to violence while transiting, you know, via land, over land. So we didn't necessarily look into the border crossing and the sea crossing. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the positive things about the way the crisis this summer was covered is that it made clear, I think, to the European public that there is a reason why people cross the sea, and it is actually, you know, almost a rational decision to make in many cases. So yeah. Well, there is not much I can say, actually, only maybe to the lady over there question. I can answer a bit more, because there was a question about invasion and foreign intervention. Yes, obviously that is the cause. And there is also another kind of intervention, which is like, you know, the pressure that is put on countries to control migration. And this is sometimes the only kind of cooperation you see in this area. There is little less going on, and that is not helpful either. So, yeah, definitely that is correct. And your remark, in a way, kind of connects to what she said about, you know, the need to look at those things in an historical perspective, because there are well-established routes that Ethiopians and Eritreans have been taking, for example. We don't do it as much in this report. We focus, like, we obviously do a literature review, but I didn't go through it in the presentation. We obviously did it, but it focused much more on recent research, just because this is more kind of applied research. But yeah, definitely, I think not only for the Eritreans and Ethiopians, but also in other contexts, looking at things in a historical perspective would be more helpful than we tend to think. We tend to think that this is an academic concern that doesn't help policymakers, but it's not the case. But we didn't have the space. We didn't have. It was not the scope. Was beyond the scope of the project of the report. And then again, you mentioned again, you know, that needs to be texted and needs to be attention to the distinction between refugees and migrants. And yes, definitely. I mean, in answering his question, I didn't want to say that these doesn't need to be done, that we don't do it. We do it as much as it needs to be done. But we also, I think we would also, cautiously kind of insist on the fact that there is a danger also in not refusing to see the protection needs. I mean, the people who move for reasons other than immediate danger and conflict and humanitarian reason are also exposed to significant risk today. And there needs to be a recognition of that as well, somehow, because otherwise we risk reinforcing, distinction that put a lot of people, I think, increasingly in danger today. And especially because the donors' agenda is very much oriented towards distinguishing sharply and making migration more difficult for everyone. I think that there is a need to insist on the fact that there are different categories of people. I mean, protection is much more and needs to be considered more holistically than just what happens in the country of origin. Also because sometimes when people reach their final destination or their temporary destination, they left their country of origin many, many years earlier. This is the case, for example, of Ethiopians who used to work and live in Saudi Arabia and now are in Egypt or in other countries in the area. So, yeah, I hope that kind of answered your questions. There was one last remark, but yeah, I don't know about the joke about Merkel and the king of Saudi Arabia, but I look into that.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I have just two, maybe not questions, but I'm just inquiring about things that you said. You mentioned that something about the Syrians, but there were very few in your interviews. But you mentioned that they were taking the irregular, route, because what we know about the Syrians that they come here by flight, and then if they take the irregular routes, it's the Mediterranean. But you talk about irregular route from Syria.
That's an interesting question, because one of the questions that was presented to us by the people who commissioned the report, so IOM practitioners, and also something that UNHCR has had, there was a concern that there was a southern route for Syrians to come into Egypt from Sudan and other neighboring countries. And they wanted somehow us to assess the size of the phenomenon. So it's not that big from what we could see, especially through research in Khartoum. But there were cases of Syrians that came through the south, and one of the families I met was, made it to Egypt in that way. And I think that gives you an idea somehow of something perhaps, I mean, I'm kind of speculating there, I cannot be sure, but I think it gives you an idea of how scattered, much more complex the Syrian movement is nowadays. We tend to think that
Do we hear about this movement? For me, it's first time. Sorry?
We cannot hear you very well.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the irregular movement of this of Syrians she was mentioning, because I didn't hear about it. And then the last thing, I think Najla has asked you about that. It's about the Ethiopian who left Ethiopia and then he came back to Ethiopia. So is it quite common that they leave irregularly and then they go back?
Yeah, I think there is an issue of refoulement. Like, I don't know about Sudan, but there are deportations. I mean, it's not
so it was
people who get
deportation.
detained and then they have no other option but returning to their countries, and some of them try again. Yeah, we talked to a lot of returnees in Ethiopia.
Yeah, I misunderstood. I thought it was a decision to return to Ethiopia. It was a deportation.
No, I mean, I'm not aware of whether it was deportation or not in that specific case I mentioned, but I think we talked to both categories. Marcus talked to both categories of people, and in some cases, whether the return was voluntary, it's a bit difficult to say, but it's not clear for the person involved as well. So